The first rays of sunlight filtered through the curtains of Eli Johnson's small but cozy home, illuminating the modest kitchen in warm hues. Eli stood by the counter, pouring a steaming cup of coffee, savoring the calm before the bustle of the day. It was his ritual, a few moments of quiet reflection before heading out to the school bus depot. His wife, Tessa, was still asleep upstairs. She worked late shifts as a nurse, and Eli made sure to tread lightly so she could rest. Their daughter, Mia, was away at college, a point of immense pride for both of them. She was the first in the family to attend university, and every sacrifice Eli and Tessa made felt worth it. Eli took his coffee to the kitchen table and glanced at the schedule he'd laid out the night before. Today's route looked no different from the hundreds of mornings he'd spent behind the wheel of bus number 23. He chuckled to himself. After a decade of driving, the kids had become like an extended family. There was Zane Carter, the boisterous athlete who never seemed to stop dribbling an imaginary basketball. Then there was Naomi Grant, who always buried herself in a book and kept her headphones on, oblivious to the chatter around her. And of course, the class clown, Jordan, who lived to make the other kids laugh, sometimes at the expense of the rules. "Time to get moving," Eli muttered, finishing his coffee and placing the cup in the sink. He grabbed his jacket, a worn leather one Tessa had gifted him years ago, and stepped out into the crisp morning air. The quiet hum of the neighborhood was familiar and comforting. The houses here weren't fancy, but they were full of hard-working families who greeted him warmly as he drove by each day. At the bus depot, the usual camaraderie greeted him. The other drivers were preparing their vehicles, sharing stories about their routes. "Morning," Eli called out Hannah, a fellow driver. "Morning," Eli replied with a nod, running his hand along the side of bus number 23 as part of his routine inspection. The bus had seen better days, but Eli treated it with the care of a craftsman tending to his tools. Satisfied, he climbed into the driver's seat, adjusted his mirrors, and started the engine. The familiar rumble beneath his feet was like a steady heartbeat, grounding him for the day ahead. The first stop was at the corner of Maple and 2nd Street. As always, Zane was the first aboard, his energy already at full throttle. "Morning, Mr. J," he greeted, throwing his backpack onto the seat beside him. "Morning, Zane," Eli replied with a smile. "Practicing for the NBA again?" "You know it," Zane said, pretending to shoot a three-pointer down the aisle. Next came Naomi, clutching a thick novel to her chest. She gave Eli a shy nod before sliding into her usual spot near the front. Behind her, Jordan bounced up the steps, cracking a joke that made the other kids erupt into laughter. The bus quickly filled with chatter and laughter, the kind of noise that Eli had grown to love. As he drove through the neighborhood, Eli felt a sense of pride. These kids were full of dreams and potential, and he liked to think of the bus as a safe haven for them, a space where they could be themselves, free from the pressures of home or school. By the time Eli picked up the last group of students, the bus was alive with energy. The kids talked about everything from video games to weekend plans, their voices blending into a hum of youthful exuberance. Eli kept his focus on the road, but couldn't help smiling at their excitement. Turning onto Oakwood Avenue, Eli noticed something unusual in his rearview mirror. A police car was trailing them. At first, he thought nothing of it. School buses often drew attention, especially in residential neighborhoods. But as he continued driving, the patrol car stayed close, its presence unmistakable. A sinking feeling settled in Eli's stomach when the red and blue lights flashed. The siren let out a short, sharp wail, and the bus fell silent. "What's going on, Mr. J?" Naomi asked from the front seat, her voice trembling slightly. Eli tightened his grip on the steering wheel and pulled the bus to the side of the road. "I don't know," he said calmly, though his heart was pounding. "Just stay in your seats. Everything will be fine." The kids exchanged worried glances, their earlier excitement replaced by uneasy whispers. Eli glanced at the patrol car in the mirror as two officers stepped out, their expressions stern. His chest tightened. This wasn't the first time he'd been pulled over, but it never got easier. One officer, tall and broad-shouldered with a buzz cut, approached the driver's side window and tapped it firmly. Eli rolled it down, meeting the officer's sharp gaze. "Driver's license and registration," the officer said. His tone clipped. Eli nodded, keeping his movements slow and deliberate. "Sure thing, officer." He reached for his wallet and handed over the documents. His mind racing. He hadn't broken any traffic laws, and the bus was in perfect working condition. What was this about? The second officer, shorter with a mustache, peered through the windows of the bus. "You driving this bus legally?" he asked, his tone dripping with condescension. Eli suppressed a sigh. "Yes, sir. All my paperwork is in order." The buzzcut officer frowned as he flipped through Eli's documents. "Step out of the vehicle," he ordered. Eli froze for a moment. "Is there a problem?" he asked, his voice steady despite the unease building inside him. "Step out of the vehicle," the officer repeated, his tone leaving no room for argument. Eli's heart sank as he unbuckled his seatbelt and opened the door. The kids' eyes were glued to him, their faces a mixture of confusion and fear. "Stay seated," Eli said firmly, giving them a reassuring nod before stepping onto the pavement. The officer motioned for Eli to move to the front of the bus, away from the kids' view. But Eli knew they were still watching. He could feel their eyes on him, their phones raised, recording every move. "Hands on the hood," the buzzcut officer barked. Eli complied, placing his hands on the cold metal. He kept his head up, refusing to show the humiliation he felt. Behind him, the kids began whispering, their voices rising in indignation. "This ain't right," Zane said loudly from inside the bus. "Mr. J didn't do nothing wrong." "Quiet, Zane," Eli called over his shoulder, his voice firm but calm. The last thing he wanted was for one of the kids to escalate the situation. The second officer turned toward the bus, his expression darkening. "Everyone stay in your seats," he barked. "This is a routine check." Routine. Eli clenched his jaw. He knew better. This wasn't about safety or procedure. It was about power, making sure he knew his place. As the tension mounted, Eli's mind raced. He had to get through this, not just for himself, but for the kids who were watching, learning, and remembering every moment. The silence on the bus was deafening, the usual hum of chatter replaced by the weight of tension. Eli stood by the hood of the bus, his hands firmly planted on the cold metal as the buzzcut officer rifled through his papers with exaggerated slowness. The second officer, with his thick mustache and sharp eyes, leaned into the bus, scanning the kids with suspicion. Zane sat in the back, his phone raised, capturing every detail of what was unfolding. "This is wrong," he whispered to Jordan, who was unusually quiet. Naomi sat frozen in the front seat, her hands gripping her book tightly. "Put that phone away," the mustached officer barked, pointing a finger directly at Zane. Zane shook his head defiantly. "We have the right to record. Everyone knows that." "Zane!" Eli called out, his voice firm but tinged with a plea. "It's okay, son. Just do as they say." But Zane wasn't about to back down. "It's not okay, Mr. J. They're treating you like a criminal for no reason." The buzzcut officer slammed the hood of the bus with his hand, making Eli flinch. "You got a problem with how we're doing our job, kid," he snapped, his voice cold and threatening. Eli turned his head slightly, addressing the officer with a measured tone. "They're just kids. Officer, let's not escalate this." The officer took a step closer to Eli, standing uncomfortably close. "You don't get to tell me how to do my job," he muttered. The hostility in his voice was unmistakable. Behind them, the murmurs from the bus grew louder. Naomi finally spoke, her voice shaking but determined. "He's not doing anything wrong. Why are you treating him like this?" The mustached officer spun around, glaring at her. "Stay in your seat and keep quiet," he barked, his tone silencing everyone momentarily. Eli's patience was wearing thin, but he forced himself to stay calm. Years of experience had taught him that anger wouldn't help in situations like this. He exhaled slowly and addressed the buzz-cut officer again. "Look, officer, I'm just doing my job. My license and registration are in order. Can we end this so I can get these kids to school?" The officer sneered, clearly unimpressed. You got an attitude, don't you? Maybe we need to take you down to the station to check everything out. Eli felt his stomach drop. You can't just take me in, he said. His voice steady but firmer now. These kids are my responsibility. I can't leave them here. The second officer smirked. We'll find someone else to drive them. You're coming with us. The kids erupted in protests. Zane stood up, his phone still pointed at the officers. You're not taking Mr. J. He didn't do anything wrong. Sit down, the buzzcut officer yelled, his voice echoing through the bus. He marched up to the door and yanked it open. I said, sit down. Zane didn't flinch. Or what? You gonna arrest me too? For what? Telling the truth. The officer stepped onto the first step of the bus, his face red with anger. But before he could take another step, Eli's voice rang out, loud and commanding. That's enough. The officer froze, momentarily taken aback by Eli's tone. They're children, Eli said, his voice carrying both authority and exhaustion. You've already made your point. There's no need to scare them. The buzzcut officer narrowed his eyes. You don't get to decide when this ends. Eli squared his shoulders and met the officer's glare. No, but I'm asking you to think about what you're doing. These kids don't deserve this. For a moment, the officer hesitated. Behind him, the mustached officer muttered something under his breath, and the two exchanged a look. Finally, the buzzcut officer stepped back off the bus, muttering, let's wrap this up. The second officer gave Eli one last glare before shoving the papers back into his hands. You're free to go for now, but we'll be watching. Eli took the documents, his hand steady despite the fire burning in his chest. Thank you, officer, he said, keeping his tone neutral. The officers returned to their patrol car, their demeanor as hostile as when they had arrived. As the patrol car pulled away, the tension in the air lingered. Eli climbed back onto the bus, his face calm but his heart racing. Are you okay, Mr. J? Naomi asked softly, her eyes wide with concern. I'm fine, Eli replied, forcing a small smile. Everyone okay back there? The kids nodded, but their faces told a different story. They weren't okay. They had seen something they couldn't unsee, an authority figure humiliating someone they trusted without reason. Zane lowered his phone, his expression a mix of anger and determination. This isn't over, he muttered. They can't just get away with this. Eli started the engine, the familiar rumble beneath his feet, doing little to soothe his nerves. Let's get to school, he said, his voice steady but lacking its usual warmth. As the bus rolled forward, the kids began to talk among themselves, their voices growing louder with every mile. Eli listened in silence, his mind racing. He knew this wasn't over. Not for him, and not for the kids who had witnessed it all. The events of that morning would ripple far beyond the quiet street where the stop had occurred. What started as an ordinary day for Eli Johnson was about to change everything. For him, for the students, and for the community they called home. The usual chatter on the bus was subdued as Eli drove the kids to school. The tension from the incident hung in the air like a thick fog, making the familiar hum of the engine feel almost oppressive. Eli glanced in the rearview mirror occasionally, watching the kids, their faces, usually animated with laughter or excitement, were somber. Zane sat stiffly in his seat, his jaw tight, and his phone gripped firmly in his hand. Naomi stared out the window, clutching her book as if it were a lifeline. When the bus pulled into the school parking lot, Eli turned to address the kids before they got off. Listen, everyone, he said, his voice calm but serious. I know what happened back there wasn't right, but I need you all to stay focused today. Okay? Don't let this mess with your heads. You got school to think about. Zane stood up, his face defiant. Mr. J, we're not just going to let this slide. They treated you like a criminal for no reason. That's not okay. I appreciate that. Zane, Eli said, his tone softening. But I don't want any of you getting into trouble because of this. Let me handle it. Handle it how? Naomi asked, her voice quiet but steady. They humiliated you in front of all of us. How are we supposed to forget that? Eli sighed, running a hand over his face. I don't have all the answers right now, he admitted. but I'll figure it out. You just focus on being the best versions of yourselves. Okay. The kids nodded reluctantly, filing off the bus one by one. Zane was the last to leave. He paused at the door, turning back to Eli. You've always stood up for us. Mr. J. Now it's our turn. Eli didn't reply, but the look in his eyes conveyed both gratitude and concern. As Zane disappeared into the school, Eli sat back in his seat, letting out a long breath. The morning wasn't even over, but it felt like he'd lived through an entire day already. Eli parked the bus in its usual spot at the depot and headed inside to the driver's lounge. The room was buzzing with activity, other drivers chatting about their routes, sharing coffee, and swapping stories. As Eli walked in, a few heads turned his way, their conversations pausing momentarily. Word of the incident had spread quickly. Hey, Eli, Hannah said, approaching him with a concerned expression. Heard about what happened. You okay? I'm fine, Eli replied, though the weariness in his voice was unmistakable. Just trying to process it. Hannah nodded, lowering her voice. You know the kids are already talking about it, right? Zane posted a video on social media. It's blowing up. Eli frowned. What video? Hannah pulled out her phone and showed him the screen. Sure enough, there was a shaky video shot from the back of the bus, capturing the officers barking orders at Eli and the kids' outraged reactions. The caption read, Our bus driver, Mr. J, treated like a criminal for no reason. This has to stop. Hashtag justice for Mr. J. The post had already been shared hundreds of times, and the comments were pouring in. Ridiculous, one comment read. This is why we need accountability, said another. Those officers need to be fired. Now, Eli sighed, handing the phone back to Hannah. I appreciate what Zane's trying to do, but this is only going to make things harder. Maybe, Hannah said, but maybe it's time people saw what's really going on. By the time Eli got home, the video had gone viral. Tessa was waiting for him in the living room, her face a mix of worry and determination. I saw it, she said before Eli could even take off his jacket. Everyone's talking about it. Parents are calling the school. People are angry. Eli sank into the couch, exhaustion weighing him down. I didn't ask for this. Tess, I just wanted to do my job and get those kids to school. I know, Tessa said gently, sitting beside him. But now it's out there. People are standing up for you. For us. For me, Eli said with a bitter laugh. Or for what I represent. Another black man treated like he doesn't belong. Both, Tessa replied firmly. And that's why you need to stay strong. Those kids look up to you. The community is rallying behind you. Don't let what those officers did define you. Eli nodded slowly, absorbing her words. She was right, as she so often was, but it didn't make the weight any lighter. The next day, Eli's phone buzzed constantly. News outlets were calling for interviews. Activists were reaching out, offering support. The school had called an emergency meeting with the parents to address the incident. Eli felt like the world had turned upside down overnight. At the school, the meeting room was packed. Parents, teachers, and community members filled every seat, their faces a mixture of anger and concern. Zane's mother, a fiery woman named Sheila, was among the first to speak. My son came home yesterday, and the first thing he said was, They disrespected Mr. J. Sheila said, her voice trembling with emotion. This isn't just about one man. This is about every child who had to sit there and watch someone they trust be treated like a criminal. What kind of message are we sending them? The room erupted in murmurs of agreement. The principal, a middle-aged man named Mr. Harris, tried to regain control. I understand your concerns, he said. We've already reached out to the police department. They've assured us that the incident is being investigated. Investigated? Another parent interjected. We all saw the video. What's there to investigate? Eli sat quietly, listening as the debate raged around him. He appreciated the support, but the attention was overwhelming. All he wanted was to protect the kids and keep the peace. But it was clear this had become much bigger than him. That evening, a peaceful protest was organized outside the police precinct. Parents, students, and community members gathered with signs that read Justice for Mr. J and "Stop Police Harassment." The atmosphere was charged, but hopeful. People chanted, shared stories, and stood in solidarity. Eli stood on the sidelines, watching as Zane led a group of students in chanting, "No justice, no peace." Naomi was there too, holding a sign that simply read, "Enough." One of the protest organizers approached Eli. "You should speak," she said. "People want to hear from you." Eli hesitated, glancing at the crowd. His instinct was to keep his head down and avoid drawing attention to himself. But as he looked at Zane, Naomi, and the others, he realized he couldn't stay silent. Taking a deep breath, Eli stepped forward and addressed the crowd. "I'm not here because I want attention," he began. "I'm here because what happened yesterday wasn't just about me. It was about every kid on that bus who had to see something they should never have to see. It's about making sure this doesn't happen to them or anyone else again." The crowd erupted in applause, their cheers filling the night air. Eli's words were simple, but they carried the weight of years of frustration, hope, and determination. As the protests continued, Eli felt something shift within him. He wasn't just a bus driver anymore. He was a voice, a symbol, and a leader in a fight he hadn't asked for but couldn't ignore. The morning after the protest, Eli Johnson's face was everywhere. News outlets ran clips of his speech from the protest, his quiet but determined words resonating with a much larger audience than he could have imagined. Social media platforms were flooded with posts about the incident. The hashtags #Justice for Mr. J and #RespectOurDrivers trending nationally. Eli sat at his kitchen table, nursing a cup of coffee while the news played on the TV. Tessa sat across from him, scrolling through her phone. "It's not just local anymore," she said, showing him a headline from a national news outlet. "School bus driver faces police harassment. Community rallies for justice." "I didn't sign up for this," Eli said, running a hand over his face. "I just wanted to do my job." "I know," Tessa said softly, "but this is bigger than you now. People see what happened, and they're angry. They're using their voices because you've given them a reason to." Eli sighed. "And what happens when the noise dies down? Those officers go back to work, and the kids are left wondering if anything will really change." Tessa reached across the table and squeezed his hand. "You've already started something, Eli. You've got the community behind you. Whatever happens next, you're not alone." When Eli arrived at the school that morning, the atmosphere was electric. Students greeted him with waves and cheers as he pulled the bus into the parking lot. Several parents stood nearby, holding signs of support. It was both heartwarming and overwhelming. Zane was waiting for him as he stepped off the bus. "Mr. J, did you see the news? They're talking about you everywhere." "I saw it," Eli said with a small smile. "But don't let all this distract you. You've got school to focus on." "Come on, Mr. J," Zane said, his grin infectious. "You're a hero now." Eli chuckled softly. "If standing up for what's right makes me a hero, then so are you." "Zane, you didn't stay quiet when it would have been easier to." Zane looked down, a little embarrassed, but clearly proud. "We're not letting this go," he said firmly. "You taught us to stand up for what's right. Remember?" Eli nodded, his chest tightening with emotion. "I remember, kid, and I'm proud of you." Meanwhile, the police department was facing intense backlash. Videos of the incident had reached every corner of the internet, and the officers involved, Bradson and Miller, were placed on administrative leave pending an investigation. The department released a carefully worded statement. "We take incidents like this seriously and are conducting a full review of the actions of the officers involved. We are committed to transparency and accountability." But for the community, it wasn't enough. The protest had grown overnight, with more parents, activists, and students joining the call for justice. The city's mayor was forced to address the issue, promising an independent investigation into the officers' conduct. For Eli, the spotlight was an uncomfortable place to be. He spent his days driving his usual route, trying to maintain a sense of normalcy for the kids. But every stop brought more attention, parents thanking him, students sharing stories of their own experiences, and reporters trying to catch him for a comment. Later that week, Eli received a call from the police chief's office. The chief wanted to meet with him to discuss the situation. Eli hesitated but agreed, knowing the community would want him to hear what the department had to say. The meeting took place in a neutral location, a community center downtown. Eli arrived to find the chief, a middle-aged man with a somber expression, waiting for him. "Mr. Johnson, thank you for coming," the chief said, extending a hand. Eli shook it reluctantly. "I'm here to listen," he said, keeping his tone polite but firm. The chief nodded. "First, let me apologize for what happened. I've reviewed the footage, and it's clear that the actions of Officers Bradson and Miller were unprofessional and unacceptable. We're taking steps to ensure this doesn't happen again." "What steps?" Eli asked, crossing his arms. "Because a statement and a suspension don't erase what those kids saw." The chief sighed. "We're implementing additional training for all officers, focusing on bias and community relations, and I've recommended termination for the 2 officers involved." Eli nodded slowly. It was more than he expected, but it still felt like a small step in a much larger fight. "It's a start," he said, "but it's not enough. This isn't just about 2 officers. It's about a system that allows things like this to keep happening." The chief looked uncomfortable, but nodded. "I understand, and I want to work with the community to make real changes." Eli stood. "If you're serious about that, you'll have the community's support. But words aren't enough. Actions are what matter." Back at the school, Zane and Naomi had taken their activism to the next level. With the help of a few teachers and parents, they organized a student-led forum to discuss the incident and the broader issues it highlighted. They invited speakers from the community, including activists, local leaders, and even Eli. The auditorium was packed. Students, parents, and community members filled the seats, eager to be part of the conversation. Zane kicked things off, his voice steady but passionate. "We're here today because we saw something that wasn't right," he began. "And instead of staying quiet, we decided to speak up. This isn't just about what happened to Mr. J. It's about making sure no one else has to go through what he did." Naomi followed, her quiet confidence commanding the room. "We've all heard the phrase, 'respect your elders.' But what about respecting the people who dedicate their lives to helping us? Mr. J has always been there for us, and now it's our turn to be there for him." When Eli took the stage, the applause was deafening. He stood for a moment, taking in the faces of the people who had come together to support him. "I don't have a fancy speech," he said, his voice steady. "I'm just a bus driver. But what I saw this past week, how this community stood up, how these kids refuse to be silent, that gives me hope. Change doesn't happen overnight. But with people like you, I believe it's possible." The crowd erupted in applause, and Eli felt a wave of emotion wash over him. For the first time since the incident, he felt like he wasn't carrying the burden alone. In the days following the forum, the movement gained momentum. What started as a local issue grew into a citywide cause. People across different communities rallied for justice, not just for Eli Johnson, but for everyone who had experienced similar treatment. Signs that read "Justice for Mr. J" and "End Racial Profiling" became commonplace in the city. Eli, though reluctant to be the face of the movement, found himself thrust into the role of a leader. He continued driving his bus, interacting with the kids as he always had. But his schedule was now punctuated by meetings with community leaders, interviews with journalists, and speaking at protests. Eli's growing prominence led to a meeting with the city's mayor, Jennifer Morales, who had been under pressure to address the situation. The meeting took place at City Hall, with several activists and community leaders in attendance. "Mr. Johnson," Mayor Morales began, "I want to personally apologize for what happened to you. It was unacceptable, and as the leader of this city, I take responsibility for ensuring that incidents like this are addressed." Eli, seated across from her, nodded politely. "I appreciate the apology, Mayor, but words aren't enough. What happened to me is part of a bigger problem, one that requires real action." Mayor Morales leaned forward. "I agree. That's why I'm proposing several reforms, including mandatory bias training for all police officers, an independent oversight board to handle complaints against law enforcement, and a policy review to eliminate unnecessary traffic stops like the one you experienced. The room buzzed with cautious optimism. Eli spoke after a moment of thought. These are steps in the right direction, but they'll only work if the community is involved. People need to see that their voices are being heard and that their concerns are being addressed. Mayor Morales nodded. We're committed to working with the community every step of the way. The police department's investigation concluded a week later. Officers Bradson and Miller were both fired for misconduct, and a public apology was issued by the police chief. While the decision was met with mixed reactions, some felt it wasn't enough. Others believed it was a strong statement. It was a moment of vindication for Eli and the community. The news brought some closure, but Eli knew the journey was far from over. The deeper issues that allowed such incidents to occur couldn't be solved with a few terminations or policy changes. Still, it was a start. The culmination of the movement came in the form of a citywide rally held in the park. Thousands of people gathered, holding signs and chanting slogans that had become synonymous with the fight for justice. Eli was invited to speak, along with other community leaders and activists. Standing on the stage, Eli felt a mix of pride and humility. He had never imagined himself in such a position, but he knew the responsibility that came with it. "Thank you," he began, his voice steady despite the weight of the moment. "Thank you for standing with me, with the kids on my bus, and with everyone who has ever faced injustice. What happened to me could have happened to anyone. But what gives me hope is how this community came together, not just to demand accountability, but to demand better." He paused, scanning the crowd. Change doesn't happen overnight. It's hard, it's messy, and it takes time. But what I've learned through all of this is that we're stronger together. And as long as we keep standing up for what's right, we'll keep moving forward. The crowd erupted into cheers, their applause echoing through the park. Eli stepped back from the microphone, overwhelmed by the support and unity before him. In the weeks that followed, life began to return to a semblance of normalcy for Eli. The protests subsided, though the conversations they sparked continued. The reforms proposed by Mayor Morales were implemented, and the community saw the beginnings of a shift in how law enforcement interacted with residents. Eli resumed his routine, driving his bus and sharing laughs with the kids. The bonds between him and his passengers had deepened, the shared experience of the incident forging a connection that went beyond the ordinary. One morning, as he pulled up to the first stop, Zane climbed aboard, his usual grin plastered across his face. "Morning, Mr. J. You ready for another adventure?" Eli chuckled. "Always. Kid, let's get moving." The bus filled with the familiar sounds of chatter and laughter as the kids boarded, their energy infectious. As Eli navigated the streets, he glanced in the rearview mirror, catching glimpses of the students, Zane practicing imaginary basketball moves, Naomi engrossed in a new book, Jordan cracking jokes. He smiled to himself, a sense of peace settling over him. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but he knew he wasn't traveling it alone. The strength of the community, the resilience of the kids, and the support of people like Tessa gave him hope for the future. As the bus rolled toward the school, Eli felt a renewed sense of purpose. He wasn't just driving a bus, he was driving the next generation forward, 1 mile at a time. Months later, Eli attended the grand opening of a new community center funded by local businesses and donations. It was named the Unity Center, dedicated to fostering understanding and collaboration between law enforcement and the community. Eli was invited to cut the ribbon, a gesture that symbolized the impact he had made. As he stood before the crowd, flanked by Tessa, Zane, Naomi, and other supporters, he felt a profound sense of accomplishment. The incident that had shaken his world had also brought about real change, a reminder that even in the darkest moments, there is light to be found. The crowd erupted in applause as the ribbon fell, marking the start of a new chapter for the community. Eli smiled, his heart full. The journey wasn't over, but for the first time in a long time, he felt hopeful about where the road would lead.